Were they really prioritizing security? Were they able to actually give this the level of seriousness that it really deserves?
Welcome to the Center for AI Policy podcast, where we zoom into the strategic landscape of AI and unpack its implications for U.S. policy. I'm your host, Jacob Kraus, and today's guest is Jeffrey Ladish. Jeffrey is Executive Director of Palisade Research, and we chat about cybersecurity, cyberoffense, AI, and the connections between the three. I hope you enjoy. Jeffrey, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
To start, what drew you into the AI space? What motivated you to work on it?
Yeah, well, since college, I've been very interested in the impacts of technology on society, and in particular, maybe some question of like, oh, where's this all going? Like, what happens when you just keep playing forward technological development? I was very interested in impacts of climate change and sort of, since the Industrial Revolution, all of the ways in which, we're like changing the planet in a big way. And then you have the invention of nuclear weapons, and suddenly you have the ability to destroy whole cities, and maybe even cause large climate effects from nuclear war. And then I became interested in, also what about biotechnology? What about biological weapons? Wow, it seems like we have, control over something that could be potentially very destructive. And then I think AI, I started reading about AI from, I found Eliezer Yudkowsky's work and Nick Bostrom's work, and the arguments made a lot of sense. I was like, oh yeah, at some point we'll develop systems smarter than humans, and that seems very risky because if they can think faster than us, if they can strategize better than us, if they can just do things generally better than us, it seems quite scary if they're not very well aligned with our interests. And I think for a while I was like, okay, but who knows when that's going to be? That could be, is that even possible? Maybe that'll be, many, many decades. And then, in the last few years, it seems like it's not going to be that long. It seems like things are really catching up, and AI capabilities are extremely impressive. And things that we thought would be many decades out have now been happening, with increasing frequency. Yeah. So I, right out of college, I worked in cybersecurity, worked for Concur Technologies, securing their software systems and infrastructure. And at the same time, I started to get into some of this research on risks from emerging technologies. And this eventually led me to join the security team at Anthropic. I was the second person on the team, and basically was trying to figure out, how do we secure AI systems, especially when there are potentially very motivated actors, including state actors, who might want to get a hold of some of these very powerful systems.
The piece about where is it all going sticks out to me because there's a lot of ways to look at what might happen in the future, and it's usually a good bet to say, well, in the past, look at this similar reference class, look at what other technologies did, or the first industrial revolution, what was that like? But there's always some amount of uncertainty where you don't know for sure what is going to happen, especially when you invent something that might be fundamentally different from previous
I think it's very different with intelligence. And I'd say, look at, like, I spent some time in my undergrad studying biology, and I was researching monkeys. And if you want to look at monkey evolution, you can look at the other monkeys, right? You can be like, well, a capuchin monkey over here, a spider monkey over here, an orangutan over here, and you're like, well, you can like look at these reference classes and be like, yeah, this is roughly how monkey evolution goes. And sure, there's going to be some differences. There's going to be long tails over here, maybe bigger body size, different diet, how much fruit versus meat or whatever. And then humans come along, and now we're talking about cities, skyscrapers, airplanes. And if you were looking at the reference class of monkey, which humans are monkeys, we're apes, then you're going to be misled. So I think even potentially looking at the Industrial Revolution, you might be looking at the wrong reference class, because the Industrial Revolution was, this huge increase in human capacity, but it wasn't an increase in our intelligence overall. I mean, some of it was, you have libraries, you have printing press, you have all of these, information sort of technologies, but it wasn't sort of a fundamental new way of cognition. And now that we're heading towards that, I think the reference class is sort of blown wide open, and we have very little idea of how far it goes or what really happens. So yeah, in the in the context of this, I think being able to make these systems safe and secure them is quite important.
Right. And can you walk through what your work was at Anthropic on these topics?
Yeah, I mean the basic work was okay. You have a software company, fairly new. Um, how do you make things secure such that bad actors can't get access to sensitive IP, so source code, model weights? I mean, there's something very unusual about AI companies in which their IP um, can be sort of more easily stolen and reused than almost any other technology. Even if you take something like, like Google Docs or something, it's like, yeah, you could steal the source code, you could replicate Google Docs, that would be valuable. But there's a lot of infrastructure code that's involved in that, a lot of backend stuff, and like it's not sort of super easy to just immediately reuse that as like as a product. But there's something about a large language model where if you have all of the weights and you can just like run it on your own infrastructure, and suddenly you're able to just like use this super powerful system right out of the box. And then then compared to like hardware systems like like a fighter jet or something, which we can talk about later. There's an interesting example of when Chinese hackers were able to steal plans to the F-35, and they were able to sort of recreate many features of this fighter with sort of their own stealth fighter. But even then, there's a huge amount of work from that required to like take all of those insights and then turn that into something tangible. But with model weights, it is in that way, right? I can just have some model weights and I can run them, and then now I have access to this super powerful AI system, almost as simple as copy paste. So I think there's a unique challenges here with securing AI companies, which is just the IP is just so readily reusable. Um, yeah. So, but I mean, in terms of what you actually have to do to secure these systems, it's not really different than any other piece of software, right? You're just talking about a bunch of information, and so there's all of the standard things you need to do, right? There's like, do you have good physical security in your office? Are you vetting employees well? Are you protecting against insider threats? Do you have controls on who has access to really sensitive IP? Do you have really good device security? Are you making sure that no one's running malicious applications on their devices? Do you have phishing training and security awareness training? Really, all the standard stuff. But yeah, and we can talk more later about sort of, does the standard stuff cut it, or do you have to go more hardcore? Spoilers, you have to go more hardcore if your threat model is that state actors will be trying to go after your stuff. I mean, the key thing is like, if you're trying to protect against opportunistic attackers, a lot of the standard stuff, multi-factor authentication, good device security, code reviews, and good application security effort, these things can protect you quite a bit against opportunistic attackers. But once you have really motivated state actors that are deploying 0 days, you're in a very different ballpark.
Yeah. I think let's circle back to all that, but quickly finish the biographical part. What is happening now with Palisade Research?
Yeah, so last year I founded a nonprofit research organization, Palisade Research. And the thing we're trying to do is really understand what are the offensive capabilities that current systems possess. So, how well can AI systems hack? How well can they find 0 day vulnerabilities? How well can they automate different parts of the cyber kill chain? As well as how well can they deceive people? Can they phish people really effectively? Can they spearfish? Can they create compelling misinformation of the kind that might be able to swing elections? Can they accomplish tasks in the physical world? Could they assassinate someone? Could they and right now it's mostly like, could they be directed to do these things? But in the future, the question becomes, oh, could they do these things entirely on their own? So we're trying to research these capabilities because we think that the public and policymakers really should be aware of where we're at as well as where we're going, so that we have good models of like, hey, here's the threat, and that this is how we need to defend against it. This is how we need to sort of put in place responsible guardrails, both in the systems themselves and in society, and in sort of the regulatory side of things, in order to protect against some of the dangers that these systems pose.
Right. And where are we at now? What's possible with, I think phishing is possible with AI systems today, like ChatGPT. What is the current state of the art in cyber attacks?
Yeah, Jacob, the fun thing is that we don't know. Like, we don't know where we're at right now. And I think this is a thing that not a lot of people appreciate, which is to say, probably the most powerful model right now, though, with Gemini, it's hard to say, is GPT-4 or was GPT-4 until very recently. And, this model has been out for a year or so. And you might be like, cool, well, GPT-4 comes out, spin it up, see what it can do, see if, have it hack some stuff, and then you'll know what it can do, right? But it turns out that that's actually not right, because it's actually pretty difficult to elicit the full capabilities from a system like this. So you can do like chain of thought prompting, where you're like, hey, please, think step by step, right? Like let's like reason through this first, and then try to do it, and then that improves the model's performance. You can also say, think step by step, and also try this thing, and then observe what happens. So OpenAI has a code interpreter if you're on ChatGPT, and like if you've used this before, you see that it's like, oh, it writes some code, it runs the code, and then it looks at the output from the code, and then it sees like, what did that work? Did that not work? And then it can run it again, and it can sort of stay in the loop and do this a bunch. And there's many other techniques like this that you can use to like elicit more and more capabilities. So, the thing we can talk about right now is, okay, what have people managed to elicit from these systems? But the thing I want to emphasize is that doesn't actually tell us like what is possible with these models. It just tells us what has been possible so far with some amount of effort. So, I mean, so far we've seen pretty interesting results. Yeah, in phishing for sure. So like Palisade is working on a like phishing tool that basically can sort of scrape the internet and like find information about a target. Maybe it's a target company, lists all of the employees, lists the employees' interests and skill sets, and maybe their relationships. And then we can craft custom spear phishing emails for those people. We've also seen there's an interesting paper that just came out that was like, AI systems can like hack websites pretty well. And they were able to find SQL injections and like a bunch of different kinds of like standard web exploits to be able to hack websites. So, I'd say what we're seeing is like we're seeing a lot of like pretty basic capabilities, but like pretty scalable capabilities when it comes to the cyber offensive domain. We aren't yet seeing capabilities of like, oh, you like can plan this whole cyber campaign. You can do each step. You can sort of iterate on that. Like language models are still, even with sort of help from programmatic scaffolding and prompting techniques, they're still pretty bad at staying on task and being able to iterate a whole bunch of times. So for these like quick problems, like, create some code to sort of try to exploit this thing, they can do pretty well. But if they have to deal with a huge amount of information, or if they have to like deal with a longer time horizon task, they're going to be way worse at that. So, these are some proofs of concepts. These are some like early capabilities. But we don't know. We don't know where it's going to go. Like this is really just the beginning, both in terms of, what you can elicit from current models, and, the next models are only going to get better at this. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
The part that stands out is how a nation state actor with loads of resources might be able to execute a really devastating attack, even on something that has a lot of resources spent on defense. And I imagine AI can play some role in this today already through some of the pathways that you were pointing out. But what examples come to mind when you think of a really carefully thought out state actor attacks? And can you flesh out the details of what those actually look like? What are these people doing?
Yeah. Lots of great examples here. I mean, almost too many examples. Like we could spend all day talking about examples of this. I think a couple that come to mind. One is one I alluded to earlier, which was the theft of designs and engineering material for the F-35. State actors, probably Chinese state actors, were able to compromise sort of a bunch of companies, defense contractors, that were involved in this thing. I mean, with a project as complex as the F-35, you just have a huge amount of people and a lot of different organizations all working on it, and that means you can sort of go after some of the lower hanging fruit. So you don't necessarily have to compromise the most secure of these companies. You just have to compromise, the least secure of these companies, and then use their access to gain access to information that's highly sensitive. And so the Chinese state actors were totally able to do this. This like IP alone cost like more than $50 billion. Probably a lot more. And they were able to replicate a bunch of the sort of features of the F-35 in their own fighter. That's one of my favorite examples. The reason why I think this one is so important is it's just like the F-35 is obviously a super important, strategically relevant aircraft, right? So it's like something that the U.S. government really would prefer, potential rivals to really not have access to. You have a lot of incentives to secure that. It's not like people weren't trying to secure this information, but it's really hard. Another great example is in 2015, again, Chinese state actors were able to steal like 22 million records from the Office of Personnel Management. Um, and this is basically like information. So there's like the SF-86 form. If you apply for a clearance from the government, that basically it includes like a lot of information about, what relationships do you have, romantic relationships, or like, do you have any foreign contacts? Have you associated with anyone from foreign countries? Do you have any debts? Do you owe someone significant amounts of money? Do people have leverage over you? Because you want to see if these people might present a security risk before you give them clearance and access to sensitive information. But unfortunately, that's like exactly what an adversary might want, because they might want to know is there leverage over these people? Who are they associating with? How could they potentially be reached? And so this entire database was stolen, included like 5 million sets of fingerprints. And this was a huge own, like a huge L, right? Like this is really embarrassing. And one of the interesting that came out of this was that the CIA used a different database. So the CIA records were not affected, which is great, right? You wouldn't want CIA officers compromised. However, one of the things the CIA often does is it implants agents within the State Department, and they, pose as diplomats, and they, sort of have all of the access and immunity that diplomats get. But now, if you're a Chinese state actor and you have access to this OPM database, and you notice some State Department officials who really should have clearances but don't seem to show up in this database, well, they're probably CIA. So the U.S. actually had to withdraw a whole bunch of CIA agents from China, and I imagine from other countries as a result of this breach. So again, strong incentive to protect this information. This is very strategically relevant information, very bad for an adversary to have, but we were unable to secure it.
And is that a function of someone did a bad job, or is it more the case that even no matter how hard you try, there's always going to be a vulnerability? What is the theoretical limits
Yeah.
of defense?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think sometimes I present some of these examples and people throw up their hands and like, why should we even try? Like, clearly, a sufficiently motivated attacker can basically steal anything. And I think that this is like partially true and importantly not true. The way in which it's partially true is that like modern systems are very complex. There's just many, many different pieces, and if we're talking about a system that's used by a lot of people, there's going to be a lot of attack surface. However, like in order for like a state actor to really gain access to some of these systems, especially systems that have been hardened, they often have to use very expensive techniques. They have to develop zero-day vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities that have never been found before, and these often take millions of dollars to develop. And then, if they use them, there's a chance that those vulnerabilities will be detected and then patched, and then they can't reuse them. So it's like, state actors can, with pretty high confidence, compromise most targets, but they have to be very picky and choosy about which targets they're really able to compromise. And what you can do is you can greatly increase the cost to attackers, such that they're able to get far less than they would otherwise. And if your thing is important enough, like it is possible to secure against even the most capable adversaries, but you have to be willing to incur significant costs, both in terms of sort of the usability of whatever you're doing, and in terms of just like the personnel hours and sort of all of the things that you need to do to like really lock things down. Like it's doable, so it's not theoretically impossible. It's just like very difficult in practice. And often it comes down to incentives. Like, are people incentivized to actually protect this stuff? Whoever was like in charge of, the Office of Personnel Management, were they really prioritizing security? Were they able to actually give this the level of seriousness that it really deserves? And this is like what we often see in the private world, right? Which is, companies only have some incentive to secure their systems. And it's like, a company can often survive, or they usually just do survive hacks, right? It looks bad, right? Maybe they take some revenue hit, but it doesn't fundamentally compromise their business. And so, whereas, if they fail to deliver, if they fail to ship products, maybe that does fundamentally compromise their business. So they're going to be more focused on being able to ship products, being able to build stuff, than they are on securing their own systems. And this creates this negative externality where, yep, a lot of our information just gets stolen. So yeah, I mean, I think it's doable, but it can be very challenging, especially if you need to protect against some of the most advanced adversaries.
Right. And what kinds of incentives are we talking about in the context of AI models? I think I heard Anthropic CEO talking about we aim to make it so that the investment needed to gain access to our IP is higher than the value of that IP. And they said, we're not there yet, but we're trying to get there. What is so valuable to steal within the development of an AI model? What might be a target?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the sort of most obvious target is the model weights themselves, because if you have the model weights, then you really can run millions of copies of it. You can also do additional fine tuning, additional training, and that also means removing any potential guardrails that the system might have. So let's say that Anthropic developed some really powerful language model, but it was fine tuned or had other controls in place so that it was hard to use for cyber offensive capabilities. In that case, a state actor might be like, well, we want those cyber offensive capabilities. Cool. We steal the model weights and then we just fine tune it a little bit to be able to, to be super happy to, generate exploits or whatever. Yeah. And at Palisade, we've shown that it's like, it takes very little to sort of like remove guardrails in this way. If the guardrails are just have been trained in, you can just train them out. Like we took Llama 2, which took a few $1 million to train. And for a few $100, we were able to just like very quickly remove those safeguards and then get the model to sort of help us with arbitrary things that it had been previously trained not to do. So yeah, I mean, model weights are one thing. I think source code is another thing. Sort of all of the little like finicky insights that you develop in the course of training a very complex system like this can be quite valuable. I mean, there's just so many things that AI labs know that other people don't know in terms of like how to make a very powerful and very useful AI system. So it's quite valuable to be able to access that. Yeah, and I mean, I think that like the thing that Dario, the CEO of Anthropic, said makes a lot of sense, right? Which is well, okay, we know that like other actors can train models this big, so let's just make it more expensive for them to steal our models than for them to train their own. I think that makes sense right now. I think in the future and maybe even the near future, we'll be getting to the point where we're training models that have the capability to cause a huge amount of harm in society. Like this, that could be catastrophic, and I think at that point we really want to secure both, the hardware side so that other people can't train models that can cause a giant catastrophe, and the software side so that people can't, gain access to that. Even if they don't have access to the hardware themselves, they can't just like grab another model and then be able to walk out with it and potentially misuse it to serious effect.
Yeah, importantly, the cost for someone, the amount that someone could gain from hacking the Anthropic model weights does not necessarily include the costs to society if you use those to cause significant harm. So I can see some externalities there, even in like an analysis where it's based on let's make it infeasible for the actor to gain it. So what is the current state at frontier AI developers like OpenAI in their cybersecurity, and what remains to be done to make it sufficiently strong?
Yeah, so I would direct people's attention to a recent RAND report. It's sort of an interim report on securing model weights. So if you Google like securing model weights RAND report, this will come up. And one of the things they do in this report, the full report is going to come out, in the next few months. But one of the things that they outline here are sort of like, well, can we sort of say, what it would take to secure against different threat models, against different threat actors? And they have a concept of security levels. So like security level 1 is, it's sort of the standard security most companies have. Security level 2, you can protect against some opportunistic attackers. Security level 3 is like you can defend against most non-state actors, right? Like if you're talking like Lapsus Group, which hacked NVIDIA last year, if you're talking about, sort of fairly capable, like, organized groups, but that are not yet at the state level yet, you can protect against most of them. Security level 4 is you can protect against a lot of state actors, probably maybe not the top ones if they prioritize you, but you're doing, this is sort of an extraordinary level of security. And then security level 5 is you can protect against even the top state actors, even if they prioritize you. Which, by the way, I think is the threat model we have to take very seriously going forward, because I think I would guess that the AI companies are sort of now being prioritized as, probably near the top of target lists for some of these countries. And my sense, from talking to people at AI companies and, just my own views as well, is that we're probably somewhere between security level 2 and security level 3 for most of these companies. Some are probably closer to 3, some are probably closer to 2. This is a bit concerning, right? Because it means that, even some capable non-state actor groups could probably compromise them, and a lot of state actor groups almost certainly could. And it seems likely that some of these companies can get to security level 3 pretty soon if they throw resources at it, and I know a lot of them really are. So I feel pretty confident that 3 is achievable pretty soon, and I think it's really great that a lot of companies are working really hard on this. But to get to 5, even to get to 4, it's going to take a huge amount of resources, and it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take prioritization. So I would say, we're like headed in the right direction, but I'm very concerned that we're not really on track in terms of getting there in the relevant timescales.
How can we get there in the relevant timescales? What needs to happen?
Yeah. So, I think we can break this out a little bit into sort of like, well, what's the technical problem? And then sort of what's the incentive or institutional problem?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the technical problem, hey, one of the nice things about this problem is that we don't have to invent any new forms of science to solve it. That's a bit of a joke because I think, when it comes to aligning AI systems or making them very safe, we sort of have, we're sort of, the field is wide open. We have so little idea how these systems actually work that figuring out how to make them robustly safe really doesn't require sort of inventing a whole new field of science. But security is not like that. We've been figuring out how to secure systems for decades, and people have made a lot of progress. People have made progress on the hardware side, on the software side, on the sort of the physical security side. So there's a lot of sort of known things that we can apply here. It'll take some novel R&D as well. I think the RAND report mentions that we need more development on hardware security modules, sort of specialized hardware for being able to secure model weights, and other sort of crucial pieces of this software and hardware supply chain. And so, I think it's going to take a lot of skilled people. I think people with experience defending against state actors, both on the private side, like at Google and Microsoft. So I think we really want our best people from industry to be working on this, and I think we also need some of our best people in government to be working on this, right? People who have experience on the offensive side, who actually know what are the tools that the best state actors are capable of doing. I think we need a lot of resources. We need a lot of people. I think these problems are tractable but difficult. Unfortunately, I worry that the incentives are just not there. I think that AI companies don't want to be hacked, right? They definitely have an incentive. This is very valuable IP. It's not that they want some country to walk away with it and be able to make a clone AI company or anything like that. But if the cost of securing these things starts taking up a significant chunk of the overall operating expenses or R&D budget of the companies, which I think is very plausible for the level of security we're talking about, now you start to be at a pretty big competitive disadvantage if you start spending 10, 20, 30% of your overall budget on security or on figuring out the security R&D to make all this stuff work. And you're requiring your employees to go work in an environment that's much more locked down, or they can't bring in their phone. And it's very culturally different as well. So I don't see another way other than having this be, not optional, not something that as a company you can be YOLO, whatever, we're gonna make more money if we just go ahead and we don't try to lock this down. I think it starts to become an issue of national security, as well as an issue of security more broadly in society, right? I think the failure modes here are potentially very catastrophic, and I don't think we want to just trust that the normal corporate incentives will be sufficient to get to the level of security that we need. So I think that at some level it's hey, if you're getting to AI systems that really have some of these capabilities we're most concerned with, I think the government needs to step in and say, one, you're not allowed to develop past this unless you can prove that you have this level of security. And two, I think the government needs to itself invest a lot of resources in actually doing some of this R&D and in providing some of the expertise, maybe providing physical security. And I don't know exactly what this looks like, right? I think we're in pretty uncharted waters here. But it seems like some kind of public-private partnership could be very important, right? It seems like we need people who really do know what it's like to say we sent in spies into your organization and we're able to, extract your critical information, which is a thing that's illegal to do unless you're the government. So, I think the only people who really have that expertise are people who have seriously worked on the offensive side, within the NSA or within the FBI, right? We need these kind of people.
On the public-private partnerships, I'm confused why it wouldn't be enough to simply set mandatory cybersecurity requirements for companies and then let the companies hire top talent. Is there simply a scarcity of cybersecurity talent, and that's why we need to bring in partnerships? Or does the government have some of the best expertise anywhere? Why do we need to bring them in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little of both. So there is scarcity. I think like it's just in fact very hard to hire for some of these roles. Um, but I think that like talent is sort of unevenly distributed. So I think some of the best offensive security skills sit within various parts of DoD or the intelligence world.
Okay.
Um, Whereas I think like a lot of some of the best like defensive skills, security engineering skills are at like Google and Microsoft and Apple, and some of these other companies, right? Because they've been building these systems at scale, securing them at scale. So some of it is like getting top talent, but some of it comes down to trust and like verification, right? Which is to say, okay, like let's say I put in, I have regulations for all of these requirements. Like, do I actually trust that companies have implemented them well? Like, how do I check? Like, I think that we do have some models here, right? We can look at like, well, what do defense contractors have to do? Often you have to get clearances in order to work on, projects for the government. And so you could definitely have a model like that for models that have like huge national security implications. Um, but like, there is this question of like, oh, would you want companies to like directly handle nuclear weapons or like directly handle biological weapons? Like you start to have to ask like, okay, like how are they vetting their employees? Like is security clearances enough? Like is this actually is this actually sufficient? So, I'm arguing that we need something that's sufficient. And I don't know exactly what that would be. Maybe you can do it just entirely by like having, really strong security recommendations that audit and enforce. But I worry a little bit.
And you were saying that luckily, unlike with AI alignment, we have a lot of decades to look back on of research on cybersecurity. We know some really good practices, but are there areas of novel research to be done? One I've heard of is it would be great if we could put in a feature on AI chips that lets you tell roughly where it is so that we can see if it's being smuggled to China, for instance. And to do this and have it be resistant to someone breaking it, tampering with it, or even better, have it be fully guarded against that seems to require, I've heard, between 18 months to 5 years of new R&D that isn't currently being done. Are there
Yeah.
other areas of cybersecurity that require new research?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, I think that's a good example. And I think there's lots of other things related to like the chip side that would be very valuable to do. So like, tamper proofing, tamper detection, yeah, like you said, chip tracking. I also think that we need to think about sort of how do we operate systems at scale in a way that's very secure. Like when you have like a whole bunch of data centers, and you start to have like this larger attack surface, and you're dealing with like, many, many gigabytes of data or terabytes of data. How do you actually run infrastructure like that at scale in a way that's as secure as we need it to be? Like in some ways, this is a pretty unique challenge. I don't think there's ever been like a product where you're like, hey, I want to like serve this to 1 billion users or 5 billion users. But also we want it to be so secure that even top level state actors don't have access to it. I'm like, oh geez, can you choose one of these? Like choosing two of these is like not very good. And I mean, part of the answer here is I'm like, yeah, you don't serve your like AI systems with catastrophic capabilities to 1 billion people. Like you just don't. Maybe you do in the future when you figured out a bunch of stuff that we haven't figured out yet. But I think, there comes some point where you're like, oh, this system is like so critical that we need to like operate it out of a much more secure environment. So yeah, I don't think I have a whole like security roadmap in terms of like the technical R&D that needs to be done. But I know a bunch of people who are working on that, and I'm excited to see what they come up with in terms of like, yeah, what are some of these R&D questions? Because I think we need that roadmap, right? We need to figure out, yeah, what are the actual problems we need to solve here in order to make this work.
And to dig into the catastrophic capabilities, OpenAI put out a preparedness framework for catastrophic risk, and they put out different levels of risk on capabilities in the cyber domain. So some at the most critical level are systems that could identify functional zero-day exploits across all software projects without human intervention. I'm paraphrasing from them,
Yeah.
or devise end-to-end novel strategies for cyber attacks against hardened targets given only a high-level desired goal. So
Yeah.
let's say we had that level of capability. What would you be worried about that system being able to do, whether it's gone autonomously doing that or whether a malicious actor is telling it to do that?
Yeah, so I think in order to understand the impact of this, we have to zoom out a little bit and understand what's the state of cybersecurity more generally, and as well as this question we talked about earlier of like what are the capability of state actors, and where are their limitations. So like I think it's actually pretty interesting because overall, I would say the internet and devices have gotten a lot more secure in the last couple decades. Like I don't know if you remember like early Windows computers where they're just you just like, get viruses all the time. There'd be like weird pop-ups and stuff, and you'd be like, not again. And like hopefully that doesn't happen to you anymore, or happens very rarely, right? And that's because people have designed operating systems to be more secure, and they like now have much better processes. Especially the big software manufacturers or developers are able to write more secure code and do a lot more testing. And at the same time, state level capabilities have kept up in a significant way. Um, you know, with enough time and effort, you can take almost any piece of software and find a vulnerability in it if you invest, if you're smart enough and invest enough resources. But it's very expensive, right? So investing enough resources is kind of key here. So even though state actors can compromise almost any target, they can't compromise every target because it would be far too expensive. So they have to prioritize and choose. But if you have like an you know limitless faucet of 0-day vulnerabilities, if you have an AI system that can just like find software in anything, that limitation goes away, right? And now you're like, no, you can hack any device, right? Because you just pull up like what's the software running on this device, and then you say, all right, system, 0-day system, like go find those 0 days. It finds them, you develop some exploits for you, and now you've compromised whatever you want. So I mean, we could talk about, well, what does that mean? I mean, it means you can compromise most cars, most hospitals, most any part of government, any company. There's this question about offense defense balance, right? Which is like, oh well, maybe if attackers have this, maybe defenders also have this, and it becomes this like cat and mouse game, which is like, can you patch vulnerabilities faster than attackers can exploit them? But this is tricky, right? Because attackers like only have to find one or a couple in order to gain access, whereas like you need to patch all of them. And so even if you know where they all are, you're finding them a lot. Like it takes work to do that patching. And maybe you could automate parts of that for sure. Like that's true. You can do some of that. But often there'll be a lot of limitations in terms of just the speed that you're able to do that. And it also really depends on like what your capacity as an organization is, right? Like this is sort of already a big problem. When I first entered the security industry, one of the things that my team did was run vulnerability scanners across our environment. These are like commercial products made by security companies, and it just finding existing vulnerabilities that we already know about. And so we'd find hundreds or thousands of them across, because it's like you're talking about a lot of computers, right? You're talking about a lot of machines, and then we'd prioritize them and then we'd patch them. But it was slow and it took a long time. And and so it's like, how much resources are you putting into that? And so yeah, I mean, I think that like with the automated 0-day thing, you start to get into a pretty crazy world. And then the sort of end to end cyber kill chain automation, which is I think what that's kind of pointing at. Yeah, now now you can any script kiddie basically can like go and point the system at a target and has a decent chance of being able to compromise that target. And so that greatly increases the number of threat actors who can compromise stuff. So I think with that, you'd see a huge increase in malware. You'd see a huge increase in ransomware, and just like a lot more like cybercrime as well. And state actors would be able to scale their attacks as well. Yeah, it'd be in both cases I think a little wild.
Can you step back to a more general perspective here and tell people about the security mindset?
Yeah. So and the security mindset. A lot of people have talked about this. I think Bruce Schneier has some great he has a great blog, and he's discussed this in a few essays. But it's basically like thinking. It's like how do you think like an attacker? Like how do you when you see a system, are you thinking about like what are the ways that this system like performs well? Or are you thinking about like, wait, can I find vulnerabilities in this system? I think a lot of times when I'm looking at an AI system, Someone's like, hey, we made this cool ability to like clone voices, and they're like, oh yeah, great, we'll be able to like make funny music. You can like, be like, you can have Obama singing a Taylor Swift song or whatever. And I'm like, oh yeah, you can fish people, right? Like you can impersonate, you could impersonate someone's parent, or you can impersonate someone's colleague and like get them to send you money, right? Like, OpenAI releases this like, a video image generation, and you're like, oh cool, I can like, make a cool dance video, or I can like make a cool video of a boat, and then I'm like, oh, I can like, show, some secret political deal and like live action from the White House, and this deal goes down or whatever. I don't know exactly what the right thing is, or like, impersonate someone's death, right? You could like get a video of someone being assassinated and then put this on social media, and people are like, oh my God, the Brazilian president got assassinated, and we have this video of it, but it's fake, right? So I think it's like really trying to put yourself in the mindset of an attacker, and think about like, all of the ways that the system could be misused, either by finding like actual exploits in the system, but also just figuring out, ways at which, people didn't think about this. Another example, one of the things that we're doing at Palisade is testing phishing, right? We're testing like how well can AI systems phish people. And so we're like developing a sign up form so that people can sign up to be a sort of testing population. We're not going to like actually steal your information, but we'll see if you'll click a link. We'll see if you're, like enter something that you probably shouldn't. And then let you know that you've been phished, and get some data at the same time about how successful these attacks are. And we're like, hey, we want to make sure that people consent to do this. We don't want to deceive people who haven't consented. So a naive person might be like, great, well, we'll put up a form. We'll have a checkbox that says, do I consent, and then input your email, and then there you go, right? Now we have all this list of emails, and we can phish people. And then like if you're an attacker, you might be like, okay, but couldn't I put in Jacob's email and say I consent? Like, how do they know it's Jacob? And I'm like, oh yeah, you probably want to put in email verification, because otherwise people will totally sign up their friends who did not at all consent to be deceived or phished here. So it's like that kind of thing, right? It's just like, are you thinking about, how an attacker would work? And I think what's challenging here is that for a lot of people, this is a very unnatural mindset, even extremely smart, extremely technical people, right? So I think a lot of people developing AI systems are very smart. They're not dumb. Like they could totally follow along to any, technical conversation. They can understand how, zero-day vulnerabilities work. But when they're building a system, they're thinking about how it can be functional and work and help people. They're not thinking about, oh, how could this be misused, or how could this be compromised, or how could this be, made more vulnerable. So I think as a result, for better or for worse, people end up having these big blind spots that sort of keep them from seeing, ways that things could go wrong, both in terms of like, cybersecurity, but also in terms of like, is your AI system aligned? Like, is your AI system going to do things that you really didn't want it to do? So yeah, that's my summary.
Very nice. And before we wrap up, was there anything else you wanted to share with listeners?
I think it's like going to be quite important that people start thinking about like ways in which society is just very likely to change as a result of these technologies. We've been talking a lot about like the macro implications and like, oh, how might this impact policy, or how might this impact sort of like what the companies should do. But I think like what's likely to happen for a lot of individuals is just that like a lot of people are going to try to scam them, are going to try to hack them, are going to try to like deceive them using AI systems. I think people need to start being more skeptical about voice calls or video calls. Like just because you get a voice call from someone doesn't mean that the voice that you hear is actually the voice that you think you're hearing. And same with the video call. Like this is going to happen, I think, pretty quickly. And I think it's going to catch a lot of people off guard. And so I do think there's a component of like trying to educate people and trying to be like, hey, you can defend yourself by like being aware of what capabilities exist, and starting to think about like, oh yeah, how do I check? Like this was weird. Like, just like slightly increase your spidey sense for things that, you didn't have to pay attention to a few years ago, but, increasingly so is going to be important to take note of.
Great. And where can listeners go if they want to learn more about these topics or your work?
Yeah, so they can go to palisaderesearch.org, and that's where we'll be posting our work and updates and that kind of thing.
Great. Thanks, Jeffrey, so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Great being here.
Thanks for listening to the show. You can check out the Center for AI Policy podcast Substack for a transcript, links, and more. And you can reach me with any feedback at jakub@aipolicy.us. Looking ahead, next episode will feature Jason Greenlow discussing the role of legal liability in keeping AI safe. I hope to see you there.